Nothing was technically wrong. That was the sentence everything fit inside. No one yelled, no one disappeared. Plans stayed mostly the same, messages were answered, you were spoken to. If someone asked how things were, you could answer without lying. You were not being hurt, nothing bad had happened that day. There was no clear reason to complain. Things kept going. You did what was expected. You adjusted when needed. You watched what you said. You kept your tone steady. You chose words that would not cause trouble. From the outside, it looked fine. People would have said it was fine. You might have said that too. Nothing obvious was missing. You were included. You were informed. You were asked sometimes. You were not shut out. You could still smile. You could still get through the day. You could still explain what was happening without sounding dramatic. Each moment by itself was manageable. You could point to it and say, "This is okay." Then the next moment came, and the next. You waited for something clear to happen, something that would make it make sense. It didn't. So you stayed. You told yourself this was normal. You told yourself that if something were wrong, it would be easier to see. Nothing crossed a line, nothing had a clear name, and that was the situation you were in. There were small moments you noticed, not enough to point to, enough to remember. You would say something simple. It would land strangely, not wrong, just off. The response would be polite or quiet or delayed. You would feel the need to explain, even though nothing bad had happened. Plans would change slightly, not canceled, just shifted. You would adjust without comment. It seemed easier that way. You noticed how often you checked yourself, how often you paused before speaking, how often you rewrote a sentence in your head before letting it out. Nothing stopped you outright. You stopped yourself. There were looks you couldn't quite read, silences that lasted a little too long, jokes that felt thin after they were said. You noticed the feeling, then let it go. Later, you would replay the moment, not because it was dramatic, because it stayed with you. You began to watch patterns in small things, tone, timing, what got answered quickly, what didn't, what seemed welcome, what seemed to cause a shift. You never reached a conclusion. There wasn't enough there. Each moment had a reason, or at least a possible one. You told yourself not to overthink. You told yourself it was nothing. You told yourself you were being careful, not cautious. Still, you were paying attention, not because you wanted to, because something kept asking you to. And you didn't yet know what that something was. The same things kept happening. Not in a way you could explain, in a way you could recognize. You would speak. The room would shift slightly. Not always, often enough. You learned to feel it before you understood it. You would bring something up. It would be acknowledged. Then it would fade. Later, it might return as if it were new. You noticed that too. You would adjust once, then again, then again. No one asked you to. You just did. The rules were never said out loud, but they stayed consistent. Certain topics stayed light. Certain feelings stayed unspoken. Certain moments passed without comment. Nothing was enforced. Everything was felt. Over time, you stopped checking whether something was real. You checked whether it would land well. You noticed how effort flowed in one direction, how clarity seemed to cost you more than it cost anyone else. Still, each moment had an explanation. You could always find one, or borrow one, or make one that sounded fair. So nothing added up to a problem. It added up to a rhythm. And you lived inside that rhythm longer than you planned. You changed small things first. The way you asked questions, the way you told stories, the way you brought things up. You softened your words, you shortened your sentences, you waited for better timing. You told yourself this was normal, people do this. You learned what to avoid, not because it was wrong, because it made things heavier, You didn't want that. You stopped mentioning certain thoughts, not forever, just for now. You kept them to yourself until they felt smaller. You became careful without deciding to be. You noticed yourself scanning reactions. You noticed yourself preparing for them. You took responsibility for the mood. If something felt off, you looked at yourself first. You asked what you could have done differently. This felt reasonable, mature, fair. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt like being considerate. It felt like being flexible. Over time, this became the way you moved. You didn't think of it as change. You thought of it as learning. You were still there, still present, still involved, just more contained than before. Something began to change in you. Not all at once, slowly. You felt more tired than the days explained. Not exhausted, just worn down in a quiet way. Rest didn't always help. You noticed a delay between feeling something and knowing what it was. You would sense discomfort first. Understanding came later, sometimes much later. You stopped trusting your first reaction. You double-checked it, then you checked again. You wanted to be sure you weren't making something out of nothing. You felt smaller in moments that should have been neutral, not afraid, just careful, as if space had narrowed without being announced. You found it harder to speak freely, not because you were stopped, because you had learned the weight of certain words. You chose lighter ones. You noticed a gap between who you were inside and who you were allowed to be out loud. You didn't think of it as loss. You thought of it as adjustment. Your body noticed before your mind did. A tightness, a holding, a sense of waiting even when nothing was happening. You became good at staying steady, so good that you didn't notice the effort it took. Nothing was clearly wrong, but something was being spent, and no one had named the cost. There was one thing you did know. You did not feel like yourself. Not in a dramatic way, not all the time, just enough to notice when you were alone. You could still function. You could still explain things. You could still point to reasons why this should be fine. But inside, something stayed quiet in the wrong way. You weren't confused about events. You were confused about yourself, about why simple moments felt heavy, about why you needed so much effort to stay even. You kept looking for proof, something clear, something solid. It never came. What you had instead was a steady feeling you couldn't place, a sense that you were holding more than you should have been. You weren't imagining things, but you couldn't explain them either. You noticed that relief only came when you were away from it, not because things were bad there, because you could breathe without watching yourself. That was hard to accept. It didn't match the story. It didn't match the facts. Still, it was there. Nothing had gone wrong in a way you could name. Nothing had happened that demanded action. But you were changed. You had learned to live inside limits you never agreed to. You had learned to stay quiet without being told. You had learned to carry weight without calling it weight. And the truth was simple. Nothing was technically wrong, but you were not okay. That was the part no one said. That was the part that stayed. And that is where this ends. When nothing was technically wrong,